Okay, I think we're all in the room, so we may as well get started with our final presentation in here for the day. Sal is between us and beer, so
or wine.
Beer or wine, yes, the alcoholic beverage, your choice.
Or the non-alcoholic beverages as well.
So, without any further, I'd like to introduce Sal D'Agostino. Got that right? Representing here from Kantara. So those of you who were in the Kantara event earlier this morning, we were talking a little about IRM, Identity Relationship Management, and this is a deeper dive into that. So Sal, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, everybody, for coming today, and yeah, I will certainly get you out of here on time. So I'm going to talk about identity relationship management. It's a normal start of the room. How many people are familiar with the term? How many people have heard talks on the topic before? Okay, a few. All right, good. All right, well, that gives me a little bit of help instead of setting what's here. So this is actually something that started about 4 years ago. It was a group of folks who were having a conversation, maybe over a cocktail hour, about what was going on in the identity management world and maybe some of the challenges that existed out there. That then became a working group inside the Kantara initiative. So is everybody here familiar with the Kantara initiative? Mostly used to be the Liberty Alliance, standards development organization that's responsible for a whole lot of very good things, as you can see down at the bottom of the page. And what I'm going to be talking about is another one of the interesting pieces of work that came out of Kantara. So it started in 2013 with a conversation and actually became a document which was presented back in 2015, which were called the Design Principles of Relationship Management. Once we got that out there, we said, great, we figured out that there's an issue here, and we know that we need to do some things which are address some of the challenges around identity, but we then stop back and say, okay, well, what is it really, and what problems does it define? So literally for the next year or so in the working group, we were just kicking around, what is this thing? What is identity relationship management? Is it really what identity management meant to be? Is it something else? And we took quite a lot of that. We created slide decks to try to popularize the notion. And then we went about trying to actually find examples of IRM in the wild. And I won't ask you to actually say what it is, but does anybody out in the audience actually think they're doing IRM today? Mezzo, maybe, thinking about it? Yeah, well, that's sort of what we wanted to figure out too. And so as we began to look at this, we tried to see, is this something that happens when you do DNS? Is this something that happens when you do IoT? Is it something that happens when you do identity management in general? And what were some of those examples? And then what we were doing is, as we were looking at those various examples out in the wild, we were comparing them to the principles that we had in that original work, and then reworking those principles. And the reworking of those principles resulted in a report that's just been published by the Kantara Initiative. So this is now publicly available. There's the long URL. There's a tiny URL, which is Identity Relationship Management Working Group refining design principles on IRM. That was the best I could come up with, a tiny URL, which isn't that tiny in that case. And as I said, this is related to a lot of other stuff that's going on in Kantara, a lot of which actually is right in the intersection of what we would call relationship management. So the work that's going around in Kantara on user managed access, which a couple of people in the room have been members of, which I've been a long-standing participant. CIS is consent and information sharing work that's going on in Kantara. There's an identity of things effort, the autos, OAuth Trust Federation. So there's a lot of different things going on inside Kantara which talk to relationship management. And one of our next steps is going to be to sort of try to bring that broader community into this. Definitions, everybody's got one. Everybody says that, ask a crowd of identity people a definition for an identity term, and you just figured out how many people are in the room. And this is sort of true here, but anytime that we were going back and looking at this, we seemed to keep finding some aspect of relationships being defined, right? And it was always going back, and even to this definition that says, what matters is the context. And I think at the end of the day, what we really realized that we were managing was context, right? And relationships were just a way of expressing that. So then that tends to lead you to the conclusion that, these existing definitions of identity management, don't quite cut it, right? So, processes and policies involved in managing the life cycle known in a particular domain. Maybe not anymore, right? And is it really particular to a domain, or is it that domain at this second, right? Or if you look at the ISO definition, which was that, or the Gartner definition, or Source Security's definition, all of these things don't seem to quite fit exactly what's going on in the world. And the reasons are pretty well documented, but legacy is controlled by the organization. It's not controlled by the individual. They tend to be limited in scale. They're not very good externally. The context of the identity is always a little sort of muggled, right? It's like, I'm going to do whatever I need to make that identity fit me, not sort of take it at its essence, I guess. And it doesn't model identity well, at least the way it exists today, and it really doesn't play nice with others. So, so really, what is this, right? Is it a security discipline? Is it a countermeasure? Are we doing privacy? Is it a business thing? It really sort of makes us question a little bit. It's like, what tomorrow are we going to be asked to do with the tools that we've got today? And is it the same thing that we're doing today, right? And these were all things that we kicked around, in detail, right? So just in sort of looking at it, right, it's more external than internal, right? Of the people who are managing identities today, is this true in your enterprise, right? Is the focus now what's going on outside as opposed to inside? Are the conversations around consumer identity and access management, something that's really on the front burner? We think it is, and it's indicative with this. It's not a simple thing, right? Who get to map this flow, right? But this is, flow's not covered by HIPAA, right? So if you're doing privacy and you were mapping all your HIPAA flows and you thought, well, gosh, I got out my workflow and I covered absolutely everything that's covered by HIPAA, I'm all set when it comes to taking care of people's health information. Well, maybe not, right? So context matters, right? So a priori HIPAA, nice thing. In context, well, maybe one of these other relationships is in play, right? And if you Google, I'll provide the deck, obviously, and all these things are searchable. And as you saw in Andre's presentation, just many, many, many of these things, right? So, the 50 billion IoT devices that are out there in the world, showed through multiple charts that are out there, being used for absolutely everything, happening really fast, right? That's the curve, right? People reading the Superintelligence books about how we're going to get so smart in the next 10 years, we'll be useless, sort of things, and there's all sorts of analogies to, like, if you look at GDP, somehow intelligence is supposed to map to GDP. I don't know that that's quite true, but whatever's going on is happening pretty quickly, right? And fundamentally, there's just lots of different relationships that are out there in the world, right? So this is not a hierarchical IAM with an admin, a user, and a public, and a single asset category, right? Not in the least, right? So if you're going to go try to deal with all these things, what are some of the rules or requirements? The mandatory jokes about Internet of Things, right? Scale's threatening to cut off the fridge, and let alone the scale threatening to cut off the fridge, but they're all conspiring together to do whatever it is that's best for them, right? And this is not so far-fetched, unfortunately. If I mean, how many devices in your home are actually really taking direction from you as an individual, right? It's, you know, not too many at the end of the day, right? So, and while we all love these things, you know, I mean, I happen to do a lot of work in the physical security industry. I've been for decades putting cameras in places all over the planet, reading people's license plates. And so I'm pretty familiar with what you can do with a surveillance camera. You know, when it became a hobby, it got really interesting, because then Mirai and all these other fun things that occur, because anybody can plug in an IP camera, and when that starts happening, just like anybody can plug in a refrigerator or any of the other things, you know, stuff happens, right? So that's the whole background of what's going on. So what did we come up with, right? So, you know, we weren't the first to do this. You know, the Kim Cameron's law of identity, most people in the room are probably familiar with it. If you haven't, go take a look. They're still pretty good. But I actually reread them again before this talk, and it was interesting, right? So this is 2005, the laws of identity. The internet, one of the big statements in that was that the internet needs an identity. The internet has a missing identity layer, right? Well, we certainly tried to fill whatever gap that was, right? So now, would anybody say the internet has a missing identity layer? It's got layers and layers of identity, and it's still missing it, right? It would be my way of describing it. You know, in that same thing, it talked about in 2005, that, you know, there's the evolution of these things, right? So Kim Cameron was talking about, we're not going to have to deal with people, we're going to have to deal with things. And that was a novel concept 10 years ago, right? So 10 years ago, we're talking about dealing with things. Today, we're dealing with billions of them interacting with each other. So while, you know, the laws of identity, you know, sort of could take you a pretty long way, you know, which were these, right, in case you don't remember. You know, they still have to deal with, you know, what we believe is going on in the world right now, which is this combination of cloud, mobile, IoT, and the breaking down of the barriers of the enterprise, right? The good news is that there's some budget being put at this. If you look at spending on cyber, it's like it's growing 18% a year. I don't know, George, maybe you could confirm whether budgets are really going up for this work, but you know, it's an analyst report, but it seems that people have beginning to get a little bit of religion around this stuff. I know I have some enterprise clients that once they've been hacked, they sort of get religion. You know, maybe it's still that quid pro quo for those budgets. Maybe that's just an indication that a lot of people have been punked at this point, and now there's money available for them. But in any case, there seems to be a willingness to do something here. The crowd at this event, also some indication of that. So this is where we settled, right? So now just to the actual work. So we kept boiling down and down and down what we referred to as these principles. And what I want to do is I actually want to group several of them together, and then also talk about what we had before and how we got to these. And I'll show a diagram later, but the core around here is sort of provable, mutable, and revocable. The things that we're finding is that's sort of all relationships have to have those characteristics. And for what it's worth, mutable initially was immutable in the previous go-round. It could be the case that a relationship is immutable, but immutable would be in the set of mutability, which would also include mutable things as well. So we moved it from immutable to be mutable, and one characteristic of mutable could be immutability as a kind of a way of working at that. We also had something which was called acknowledgeable earlier. Acknowledgeable we took off the board because we thought provable basically solved what was the acknowledgeable problem. We had transferable earlier, and we figured delegable kind of managed that. And again, the concept that we keep falling back to in this is that context really drives all these things. There's a full-blown report that you can go through. I'm not going to necessarily go through every aspect of these things. These are just the bullet points. There's about a page or so in the report around each of these topics. I'd be happy to get into more detail. Covering these in a 25-minute talk is not possible for me to really do today. Needless to say, provable is a very useful thing, right? Now, whatever token you're using, right? The first thing you want to be able to do is be able to prove it. I mean, proof in general in distributed worlds are critical, right? I'm not going to use the B word, but the B chain has a provable aspect to it that makes it potentially useful in relationship management. Almost everything we do in identity at some point, particularly when you're doing it with crypto or keys, has to have provable around it. Constrainable, again, it's what we try to do when we're doing access control. Mutable, again, relationships can change over time. Married today, not tomorrow. Suddenly an adult, I guess. All these things, and it's not just about individuals and their attributes, but again, this is when we're talking about these things at a relationship level. So even your relationships to other people change over time, right? At least most of mine do, even the ones that are very long term and have other aspects that don't change. Revocable, it's kind of a common tool. The more I think about this might be valid. I'm not sure. So, like the flip side of revocable is something still valid. So, I think if we play with this more, we might play a little bit more with sort of validation around revocable. But again, revocable as a core tool for doing identity management remains part and parcel of what we do. Delegable, again, this is supposed to be distributed access control in a complex world with lots of relationships. And then scalable, right? So it has to do this or else it doesn't address the billions of things and the billions of relationships and the billions of things, to the billions of people, to the billions of permutations of that stuff. So I know I flew right through all those principles, and I'm going to try to stop at the end so we can have a chance to chat about them with kind of a picture that organizes it. So I'm not just going to leave it there. I'm going to try to get to sort of what we're doing next as a working group. So we have this idea of relationship manager. It would be sort of this new kind of access control engine for all intents and purposes. The Kantara likely is already working on this and some of the other work groups that we're involved in. So it's clear that, as a member of the user managed access working group, when we're in there and we're talking about developing that protocol, I see it as developing aspects of a relationship manager. As a PDP for it should be relationships. Sorry for the typo. Personal information, consent, same thing, right? I think that the relationship manager has a better chance of incorporating privacy or consent by design by its nature than normal identity and access management would, if only because when I look at it, there's kind of an assumption around the workflow for identity that you start with a sponsor and roles, et cetera. If you look at things like consent and some of these other relationships, they may predate or be orthogonal to sort of like that normal identity registration workflow process. So it'll be interesting to see what the actual workflow looks like this. And I was kind of curious about some of the earlier presentation, particularly when AOL was talking about taking legacy stuff and then bringing new functionality on board. That really seems challenging, quite honestly. I can understand why you need to do it that way. But when you've got like new, what seems to me to be new workflow in the front of a process, it's hard not to have material impact on the process that you're about to put stuff in front of. And then as a design rule, to make the assumption that you're going to maintain that it may not necessarily work out well, or may create certain biases. This is just an observation in terms of how some of this is beginning to roll out today. And so, this is a very wonky Venn. It's not exactly Venn. It's not exactly set math. But one of the things that we were looking to do is to begin to move the conversation from this bunch of words actually into things like graph databases and set notation. So if you look here, I mean, basically what this is saying is that the provable, mutable, and revocable aspects of things are always a part of doing relationship management. The extent to which things are constrainable, delegable, and scalable to the most point depend on their, or also require them to, at the same time, be provable, mutable, and revocable. Yeah, again, it seemed that the principles were 3 things which are about the system and then 3 things about the relationship. And that's sort of where we got to at this point. So I think I have about 5 minutes left to keep you on time for the reception. So that was really fast through 2 years of work. I appreciate you staying with me through that. And I would be, so this is the Kantara IRM home at IRMWG. There's my contact information. Maybe wants to get in touch with me. Thank you for your time, and I'd be glad to take questions. And Alan went off for a phone call, and he's left me to not only answer the questions, but work the crowd. So here you go.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. Back to that provable, are all relationships treated like equally, like, or their concept of trust level of the relationship?
Yeah, okay. So provable and trust, I think, are 2 different things, right? So trust is something that you could probably, if you were to put a wrapper around the relationship, would be some sort of meta value to what's going on. I would also probably defer to whatever Justin is saying around vectors of trust as maybe another way of looking at it. I think what would be interesting to see to some extent, and I haven't even checked out where that work is going, right? But if whatever those vectors of trust that they're talking about are, in fact, so to what extent do these things impact those vectors, right? Yeah, thank you for that. Any other questions? Oh, sure.
Sorry, 2 more questions. Just one more. So I'm looking at leveraging the relationship for authorization rules. Is the market ready for that? Do you have any guidance about how do we leverage the relationship for the authorization or policy rules?
Right. So in terms of where we would go with how the authorization actually works, that's a real fun thing. I think that's a lot of what UMA's doing. And if you look at what's going on in the UMA world, right, it's protection and authorization APIs that could be done in a distributed way with some reasonable granularity in a RESTful way at scale, right? But I think all of that is kind of what's required here, So how you go about doing authorization will be driven by the context of what's taking place. And then in that circumstance, you're probably going to have to try to meet these requirements as well as what the individual's up to. George?
Whether the world is ready for it or not, they have done it already a little bit. Because if you look at Facebook and you filter who can see your posts, you're effectively doing an authorization based on relationship. Right? A friend of friend is a relationship, and you're authorizing who can see your posts.
Thank you. Anybody else? Going once? Oh, yeah, there you go. See, I am not going to be the person that's keeping you from getting to the reception.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren at Telex. Could you elaborate how you came up with constrainable, delegable, and scalable in those quadrants? Like, is scalable between identity relationship, and then it's not between the other 2?
So this is me playing around and then throwing it back at the group just as a way of sort of getting started this non-textual basis of describing the work that we were doing. The way that I saw this was that an identity itself is, you can constrain an identity, but you can't constrain a relationship on your own, right? The way that it gets to be constrainable in a relationship is when you've got these things, right? So scale, constrainable, and delegable are dependent on other circumstances being true. Whether those circumstances are provable, mutable, and revocable all the time, I'm not sure, but that was where I was going when I was looking at this. So, yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things I'm sort of here to kick around as well. Right? That, you know, it seemed to me that just playing with it shook out like it was something that was useful. And the more that I've played with it in some of the work that I've done, it seems to have held up. So, you know, I mean, as I said, I do a lot of stuff with, you know, large-scale surveillance stuff, and you know, these are things that I need to address, and you know, how I manage them has been related to whether it's the identifier or the device ID, the relationship or the context of authorization. The context has a lot to do with defining those things as well, right? So if you take context plus what's in the middle, then I think you get to exercise that stuff. But they all interrelate, right? There's nothing, none of those things don't touch the other, I think is the other thing that happens in that picture. And it probably is better done with some set math or maybe some topological mathematical exercise of some kind where some shapes are determined for each of those things. It's probably not flatland, but you know, this is just me playing with the graphical tools that we had. That's why I've got a budget into Kantara for graph databases and better stuff to move, and relational notation language and other stuff along those lines to have a better, more interesting picture on the next go round. Cool, sure.
Kind of a wonky question, maybe. We were talking about a lot of things at lunch, including GDPR, and I'm wondering, some of this is kind of new to me, and I like it. I'm wondering, do you think some of the concepts in here could be helpful towards some of the problems set forth in GDPR?
Yeah, so yes, right? So GDPR is a relationship management issue. I mean, I think that you can look at it those ways. That way. And I think that if you're going to be doing GDPR, that you could really easily use these things as ways to measure the solution that you put in place to see if in fact you do these things, then you probably are going to be doing a lot to be able to deal with GDPR. I haven't done a direct mapping. You know, this is why I want to get the other Kantara groups involved. So it would be nice. It'd be nice when we pursue this to get the Kantara UMA legal subgroup folks in, to get the consent and information sharing work group in, who are the real, you know, who are kind of our GDPR experts. Yeah, and see, and I have run this by them, right? So I've run these principles by the people in the consent and information sharing work group, and they think, yeah, that's right? You know, the characteristics of maintaining these principles also adhere to things like GDPR or most regimes. I mean, I think what we're trying to do at this point is to begin to, I mean, one of the hopes is that the design rules here can get us out of a GDPR, PDR, PII, HIPAA conversation and just get us to the point where we're designing systems that if they have these characteristics are going to meet those things by default, right? And that would be a really nice situation to be so that we could keep falling back on something that says, yeah, we meet your requirements because we designed identity systems properly, as opposed to saying, here's the identity system I designed and okay, tell me where the gaps are. Thank you all very much. It was a great day one at the Cloud ID Summit. What do you think?